Well, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Tommy Hensel and I'm excited that you're joining me for this installment of Thirsty Thursday. If you're tuning in live, thank you for tuning in live. If you're watching this later, thank you for watching it later. I will be doing two different things today, and I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. If you're not watching live and not asking me questions right now, feel free to drop questions either on Facebook below the video or on YouTube if you're watching it there in the comments section, and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. What I'm trying to do in all of these Thirsty Thursdays is to do two things. One is a cocktail, and the other is information about wine. So I'm going to start with the wine, but if you're looking at what's around me, you probably can guess which cocktail I'm getting ready to show you a little bit later, but I'm going to reveal that a bit later in the broadcast. But first, I want to talk about wine. And one of the questions that I often get from friends who are asking me for wine and food pairing is how do you best pair wine with dessert? Because who doesn't like having? I guess there are people who don't like this, but I love pairing different wines with different courses of a meal. And when you get to dessert, there are some special considerations about how to best pair wine. I'm going to look over to the right occasionally because this is where my computer is, and I want to check for any potential comments. So I'm going to be watching for comments. So pairing food and wine is not rocket science. They're just some things that you need to know as basic recommendations and basic rules. And what I'm going to be talking to you about are my personal preferences and my personal recommendations. There are many sommeliers and wine experts out there who might disagree with some of the things I'm saying. Fine, please let me know. But first, I'm going to talk about some basic tenets. In general, dessert can be difficult to pair with wine because people have some false information about what might work. There's this myth that somehow or other red wine and chocolate are a fantastic pairing, and they can be, but not usually and not always. And I'll explain why in a few minutes. The basic rule of thumb is this. If you have sweet food, then the wine that you pair it with should be at least as sweet, but preferably sweeter than the food. That's because when you taste wine with something sweet, it doesn't change the wine, but it changes your perception of the wine. The sweetness in the food will cause the wine to taste less fruity, less sweet, more bitter, and more astringent. So the combination of sweet food with a wine that's not as sweet or sweeter will elevate some of those things in the wine that you might not love. So for instance, if you tried pairing a really luscious piece of milk chocolate with a high tannic dry red wine, let's say a Cabernet or a Malbec, what's going to happen is that you're going to take a bite of that luscious milk chocolate and have all that sweetiness in your mouth, and then you're going to take a sip of that wine, and the wine is going to taste bitter and astringent and dry in your mouth, and it's not a good combination. So the goal when you're pairing anything with food and wine is that they work together in synergy to elevate your experience. You want the food to complement the wine and the wine to complement the food and everything to be better because of that combination. And what I always think about is that wine's not an add-on to the meal, it's part of the meal. So just like you would think very carefully about what ingredients you're putting together and what you're adding onto a plate to create a meal, the wine needs to be part of that consideration. So in general, sweet wine with sweet food, preferably the wine should be sweeter than the food. Now, one of the questions people often ask me, and I took a few notes so that I wouldn't jump over anything, are, okay, well then, what are some sweet wines? What are some dessert wines? And there's a number of different types of wine that can be sweet. I have to put my glasses on because I'm getting old and I can't see. First of all, sparkling wines. I'm a big fan of anything sparkling, particularly champagne, but any other kind of sparkling wine makes me happy anytime. So if you're pairing a sparkling wine with a dessert, you're going to be looking for terms like demi-sec on a champagne, amabile on an Italian wine, or maybe dolce in an Italian wine. You're going to look for the word dulce in a Spanish wine, and words like that. So basically, a sparkling wine should be at least a demi-sec in order to pair with dessert. So sparkling wine, as long as it's not too dry, you could go for something like a Moscato d'Asti, or a demi-sec champagne, or even looking carefully, but finding a cava that's maybe a demi-sec. So sparkling wine can be a lovely pairing as long as it's sweet. You also have a few very light white wines that have natural higher sugar content that can pair fairly well with light dessert, something like a Gewürztraminer, or a Cabernet, or maybe a Cabernet Riesling that's a little bit more on the dry side but has a pronounced fruit. Those can pair great with lighter dessert, something that's maybe a fruity dessert. Gewürztraminer is especially lovely with tropical fruits. So if you've got like a very light fruit tart, let's say, that a Gewürztraminer or a Riesling would be really lovely with that. But the bulk of sweeter dessert wines that you're going to find are more densely sweet, mostly white wines. And there's a number of ways that wines can become sweet. First of all, I mean, the way that wines become sweet is the grapes are sweet. But how do you make those grapes sweet without just adding a bunch of sugar to the wine? That's called chaptalization, and it's illegal in most places. Some places, will allow it to happen, but in general, what you want for a really good pairing is not a chaptalized wine, but a wine that's naturally sweet. So one of the ways that happens is late harvest wines. The grapes are allowed to hang on the vine as long as possible before frost, so that they can ripen as intensely as possible, and even over ripen in some cases, and that makes them extremely sweet. So when the wine is created, the wine is sweet. So you'll find the words late harvest in Alsace. You'll find in France, you'll find the term vendange tardive on the wines, which means late harvest. Also, German wines. A Spätlese is a late harvest wine, but what you're looking for is an Auslese, or a Beerenauslese, or a Trockenbeerenauslese in Germany, and those are in progressive sweetnesses. So late harvest wines will be naturally sweet. So those compare really well with dessert. There is a very interesting way that some very famous wines become sweet, and it's because of a fungus called Botrytis cinerea. So what happens is this fungus attacks grapes from time to time based on the climate and the weather of a vineyard. In most cases, if this rot happens to your vineyard, you're out of luck, because the grapes are ruined and the harvest is going to be not going to happen. But in some very specific conditions in very certain parts of the world with certain grapes, the noble rot, which is what it's called, can actually create a situation in which the grape can be pressed after the rot has infected it, and the wine is intensely sweet and honeyed, and a little saffron, a little ginger, but a beautiful wine. The most famous of the noble rot wines that you're going to find in the world are Sauterne from Bordeaux, Tokai from Hungary. If you're really lucky and can find some, Van de Constantia from South Africa are potential wonderful wines that can be made from the noble rot. And also all of those wines from Germany that I mentioned, the Auslese, the Beerenauslese, and the Trockenbeerenauslese all have noble rot as well. There is another method that often is called the straw mat method, where grapes are taken off the vines and put on straw mats and allowed to raisinate. They dry and shrivel up, and then they're pressed. So there's no rot involved, but you get that same intense concentration of flavor from the grapes. You're looking for terms like Vin Santo in either Italy or Greece. Passito is the method that you often see in Italy. And in Germany, they're called Strohwein. In Austria, Schilfwein. And then there's some other terms. So look for straw mat method. And then finally, there's ice wine. Ice wine is relatively rare and can be quite expensive because it's really kind of a bizarre way of making wine. You let the grapes hang on the vine until the frost happens and they freeze. It has to be a certain temperature And when it hits right, the winemakers have to rush out to the vineyard, pick the grapes while they're frozen, and press them immediately while they're still frozen, so that the water content in the grapes is actually ice, and everything that's pressed out is that wonderful, unctuous, sweet grape juice. Probably the most prolific producer of ice wine in the world is Canada. Most of the Canadian ice wines are made from the Riesling or grape, or a grape that's native to North America called the Vidal grape. But there are also interesting red ice wines being made in Canada from the Cabernet Franc grape. So if you can find one of those, it's really, really interesting. There is a final two categories of sweet dessert wines. One's not as popular as it used to be, but they're awesome wines to pair with certain kinds of desserts. They're red wines. The most common ones that I have tried and that I like are either the Bracchetto wines from Italy or Lambrusco. Both Bracchetto and Lambrusco generally are what's called frizzante, which is not fully sparkling, but they have a little bit of a fizz to them. So they're not sparkling enough that they need the special cork that you see in most sparkling wines, but they do have a little bit of a textural bubble to them, which gives them a nice mouthfeel. So look for Lambrusco, look for Bracchetto, and a few others in Italy. The Recioto della Valpolicella is another one that's very often sweet. And then there are some, in the US particularly, some late harvest red wines. You'll see late harvest Zinfandel, often late harvest Petit Syrah, sometimes Malbec, occasionally Mourvedre. So look for a late harvest. And the most common one you're going to find is a late harvest Zinfandel from California. The final category of dessert wines is fortified wines. These are my favorite for dessert: port, sherry, and Madeira. Now, port is almost entirely sweet. So you're looking for ruby port or late bottled vintage port or tawny port. Your flavor depends on the flavor of the dessert, but they're all fabulous with desserts. With sherry, most sherry is very dry, but there are a couple of forms of sherry, cream sherry and Pedro Ximénez PX sherry, that are extremely sweet, awesome with desserts. And the same thing with Madeira. Most Madeiras are going to be dry or off dry, but there are a couple of sweet versions of Madeira. Boal and Malmsey are both sweet enough to really hold their own against desserts. So that would be kind of my take on different kinds of dessert wines that you could use. So moving back in time in this episode, remember rule number one: the wine should be at least as sweet, but preferably sweeter than the dessert. And then you want to match the profile of the wine to the profile of the dessert. You don't want a super unctuous red, ruby port with a little slice of lemon meringue pie. It's not going to work well because the port will overpower the pie. Now, if you had a slice of pecan pie, all day long. With that lemon meringue pie, I would go with a lighter, sweet white dessert wine. Maybe a Sauterne might work. A Gewürztraminer could even work. So think about the texture and the flavor profile of the dessert and try to match it to the wine. But remember, sweet with sweet. So there you go. Little wine tip about dessert wines. So we're going to move on to the cocktail portion of today's Thirsty Thursday. And today I'm going to be making a cocktail called The Last Word. This is an interesting cocktail because it was a cocktail that was created during Prohibition, not before and not after. So while alcohol was illegal in the United States from January 17th, 1920 to December 5th, 1933, that was Prohibition, there were still a whole bunch of underground speakeasies. And a really well-known one was the Detroit Athletic Club in Detroit, Michigan. And this cocktail is traced back to the Prohibition era in Detroit at the Detroit Athletic Club. It was very popular during Prohibition and up through the middle part of the 20th century, and then it more or less disappeared off of menus and lived on only in historical cocktail books. The cocktail historians kind of trace the resurgence of the Last Word cocktail to a place called the Zigzag Cafe in Seattle in 2005. The bartender there found this recipe in an old historical cocktail recipe book, thought it sounded interesting, put it on the menu. It became super popular and then spread around the country. And now, 15 years later, it's on nearly every cocktail menu of note in the country, either this or a riff on this cocktail. So interesting story. There's a couple of things I love about this cocktail. First of all, it's an equal parts cocktail. My very favorite kind of cocktail, because you can't forget how to make it as long as you know what the ingredients are. Equal parts of the 4 ingredients. These kinds of cocktails, these equal parts cocktails, are super for batching for a party, because no matter how much you use, you just match that same amount of everything else, and then you can chill it and shake it out and pour it for a bunch of people. So you can batch these cocktails. Because one of the ingredients in this cocktail is lime juice, which is a fruit juice, it is a cocktail you shake. General rule of thumb, if a cocktail is all booze, let's say a Manhattan, a martini, don't shake it because that will dilute the cocktail. Oh, while I'm saying that, I need to get out the glass and the cocktail shaker. That will dilute the cocktail. I'm going to let this, there we go. It'll dilute the cocktail. You don't want that. But if you're using fruit juice in a cocktail, then you definitely need to shake it, because like with a salad dressing that's got oil and vinegar in it, you have to shake that to emulsify those ingredients. Similar concept with alcohol and fruit juice. So think a daiquiri or a mojito or something like that. You shake those cocktails and you will get some dilution of the cocktail because of the ice. But a good craft cocktail that's meant to be shaken probably has factored that in to the equation. So the little bit of water that you get there just helps balance out the cocktail. It's not going to be, it's not going to ruin the cocktail. I left this in the freezer for too long, and I think my ice is, yeah, I really wanted to use this glass, but it's not going to happen. So luckily, I chill my glassware. So instead of the Nick and Nora glass, we're going to use a coupe today. So there we go. All right. I am going to make the last word cocktail for you. So you have a cocktail shaker, and it's equal parts, 3/4 of an ounce of each piece, each ingredient. I'm going to start with 3/4 of an ounce of lime juice. There we go. All right. That's my 3/4 of an ounce of lime juice. Then I'm going to do 3/4 of an ounce of Luxardo maraschino liqueur. It's cherry liqueur. I'm going to save my favorite ingredient for last so I can talk about it a little bit. So there we go. That's the maraschino. 3/4 of an ounce of gin. Use a nice London Dry style gin here. I'm using aviation gin tonight because that's what I had in my liquor cabinet. All right. And the final ingredient is 3/4 of an ounce of green chartreuse. I love green chartreuse. This is a fascinating liqueur. It is made by Carthusian monks in Europe. The recipe traces back to the early 17th century. Historically, we know for sure they've been making it since the early 18th century. It's a secret recipe. They won't share it. It's believed that it has over 130 different botanicals. It's high proof alcohol that's infused with botanicals. And I said over 130 of them. And it's, according to the research that I have done, it's the only liqueur in the world that gets its green color naturally and not from some kind of dye. So as those herbs are macerated in the alcohol, they let them steep for about 8 hours, and that final steeping is what gives chartreuse its color. It's got a fascinating, very layered profile with a lot of bitterness, but really interesting. So you're using 3/4 of an ounce of green chartreuse. Chartreuse also comes in yellow and orange colors, obviously different flavor profiles. Green is your most prolific one. All right. I'm using a coupe today, and I am going to garnish with a Luxardo cherry. I'm using 2 Luxardo cherries with a little bit of lime peel between them because I thought that was pretty. All right. I love Luxardo cherries. keep these in your stable because it's a wonderful, wonderful thing to add to cocktails. All right, so this requires shaking. You can kind of hear it when it's done. And there you have it. I'm going to quick pop this up on the screen. You have the last word cocktail, an equal parts cocktail made of gin, lime juice, green chartreuse, and maraschino liqueur, garnished with Luxardo cherries. Of course, I have to taste it. That's just like, for me, that's like summertime in a glass. I love it. You know, and I love this cocktail because it's so balanced. It's got sweetness, it's got bitterness, it's got tartness, and it's got this hint of botanicals from here, but also from the gin. So you've got all these layers of flavor that play off against each other. So, you know, you think when you first taste it, because you're smelling the lime primarily, that it's going to be all about lime. And then the other flavors hit you in different parts of your palate. It's just a beautiful, simple, summery cocktail. I drink them all year long, actually. That just is so easy to make because it's an equal parts cocktail. So there we have it. My installment of Thirsty Thursdays. I'm hopefully, when you watch this, because I'm sure most of you who are watching it later, because I can see how many people are watching it right now live. Please send me any questions that you have. And if you have any cocktails that you would like me to try during one of these, or if you have any specific questions about wine that you want me to answer, please feel free, and I'm happy to do that. So I'm going to move my little banner here and pop over here. So that, my friends, is my Thirsty Thursday for today. I'm going to lift a glass to all of you. Take another sip. Oh, yeah. This is a nice way to end a long day. So cheers, everybody. As always, I am epicuriously yours, and I hope to see you again soon. And here we go. Cheers.